The laughter in the crowded hotel ballroom was a physical thing, a thick, warm blanket of nostalgia and cheap champagne. I stood near the wall, a half-empty glass of wine in my hand, watching my husband Julian hold court. 10 years out of college had been good to him. The boyish glint in his eye had hardened into a confident gleam, the kind that came from closing multi-million-dollar deals. He was in his element, surrounded by people who remembered him not as CEO of Vance Innovations, but as the star quarterback who once threw a winning touchdown with a sprained wrist. My eyes, like everyone else's, were drawn to the woman beside him. Celine Rossi. Even her name sounded like a sonnet. She'd been the head cheerleader, the valedictorian, Julian's first love. The one who got away when she moved to Paris for a graduate program. She hadn't aged a day. Time had merely polished her, leaving her with an effortless grace that made my carefully chosen cocktail dress feel frumpy. I saw the way Julian looked at her. It wasn't overt, nothing a stranger would notice. But after 10 years of marriage you learn to read the micro-expressions. The slight softening around his eyes when she spoke, the way his thumb absently stroked his glass. A cold knot began to form in my stomach, a familiar, unwelcome guest. The rain started then, a soft patter against the high windows, signaling the end of the evening. Coats were fetched, goodbyes were drawn out. Celine's car, a silver convertible that looked like it belonged in a magazine, was parked right under the awning. "Julian, hop in," she said, her voice like wind chimes. "I'll drop you." No sense waiting for a cab in this. He didn't even look for me. He just grinned, that easy, charming grin, and slid into the passenger seat. As the engine purred to life, a man from their old crowd, Mark, I think his name was, slapped the roof of the car and laughed, a little too loud from the open bar. "Look at that. The king and queen back on their throne. What's the hold-up, you two? Getting back together just depends on Julian's vote." Celine smiled then, a faint, secretive thing that didn't reach her eyes, but I saw the genuine pleasure in it. He liked it. He liked the narrative. Julian laughed, shaking his head, but he didn't deny it. He didn't say, "Don't be ridiculous, I'm a married man." He just let the joke hang in the humid air, a shared secret between them and their past. The small crowd around them erupted. Whistles, more jokes, the clinking of glasses. And something in me broke. A dam of composure I'd spent a decade building. I found myself moving forward, my heels clicking on the wet pavement. I started to clap, slow, sardonic claps that cut through the noise. Everyone turned to me. "What a perfect match," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. "A flat lake over a turbulent depth. Truly. When you two finally make it official, you must send me an invitation. I promise to give you a very large red envelope." The silence was instantaneous and absolute. You could hear the rain hitting the leaves. Julian's face went pale. Celine's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of feigned shock. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears, leaving that frozen tableau behind me. I heard a whisper, sharp and clear, as I reached the sidewalk. "God, Hilaire is so dramatic. No wonder Julian's never gotten over Celine." The words shouldn't have hurt. But they did. They carved into the marrow of me. They didn't understand. They didn't know about the countless business trips that overlapped with Celine's visits home, the forgotten birthdays, the way he'd sometimes look at me as if trying to place who I was. They didn't know the quiet, desperate sacrifices of a marriage built on a foundation of being suitable. Standing there on the roadside, watching the taillights of Celine's car disappear into the gray curtain of rain, I felt a bizarre, fleeting sense of clarity. The pretense was over. The facade had finally cracked, and the cold air rushing in was bracing, terrifying, and liberating. My phone vibrated in my clutch. A text from Julian. "Got a ride with Celine. She's staying at the Peninsula. I'll see you at home." I stared at the screen, the rain blurring the words. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. 1,000 responses flew through my mind, angry, pleading, sarcastic. I typed out, "Drive safely. Don't flip the car." A morbid joke. I deleted it. What was the point? Instead I just typed, "Okay." I took a taxi home. Our home. A beautiful, cold, minimalist showpiece in a gated community. Julian's trophy, and I was its chief curator. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the vast, dark living room on a sofa that cost more than my first car and listened to the silence. For 3 years I had played my part perfectly. I'd quit my job as a financial analyst to be the perfect corporate wife. I planned charity galas, I memorized the names of his important clients' children, I perfected his favorite meals. I ironed his shirts by hand because he disliked the stiffness of commercial laundering. I had built my entire world around this man, this life, and now it felt like ash. My phone vibrated again. This time it was my best friend, Clara. Not a text. A video message. My thumb hovered over the play button, a sense of profound dread settling over me. I already knew. I knew what it would show. I pressed play. The video was slightly shaky, taken from what seemed like another table in a dim, opulent restaurant. There they were. Julian and Celine. They were in a secluded booth, their heads close together. Then Julian reached out. With a tenderness I recognized, a tenderness I thought was reserved for me, he used his thumb to gently wipe a speck of sauce from the corner of Celine's mouth. The world tilted. The air left my lungs. Clara's text followed immediately. Alara. I'm so sorry. I had to show you. This isn't the first time. I saw them last month but I wasn't sure. I called her, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the phone. How long? I asked, my voice a raw scrape. Clara hesitated. From what I've pieced together. At least 2 months. Clara. I think they've always been in touch. They just got braver. I ended the call. The darkness of the house felt suffocating, accusatory. I walked to Julian's study, the one room I usually treated as his sovereign territory. I sat at his expensive computer and turned it on. I knew all his passwords. He'd given them to me once early on, a gesture of supposed transparency. Nothing to hide from my wife, he'd said. I'd never used them. I trusted him. Now I logged into his social media, his email. It was all there. A digital monument to my naivety. Birthday messages to her every year. Comments on her photos from exotic locations. Wish you were here, he'd written on a picture of a sunset in Bali. A trip he told me was a high-stakes, men-only business retreat. There were emails too. Innocent on the surface, but laced with a familiarity that spoke of a continuous, private thread running parallel to our marriage. He hadn't forgotten how to be thoughtful. He had just been directing his thoughtfulness elsewhere. The front door clicked open at a little past 1 a.m. Julian came in quietly, assuming I was asleep. He jumped when he saw me sitting on the sofa in the dark. Alara? What are you doing up? Waiting for you, I said, my voice eerily calm. Did you see Ms. Rossi home safely? Yeah, he said, hanging up his coat, not meeting my eyes. She's at the peninsula. Quite a drive. I nodded. Yes. From the peninsula to here is indeed quite a distance. He stopped, turned. You knew where she was staying? I stood up and walked toward him. I've always had one question, Julian. Why me? Why did you choose me back then and not Celine? He frowned, his face clouding with irritation. Why are you bringing up ancient history? Because I just discovered it's not history, I said, my calm beginning to crack. It's a current event. For 3 years, you've remembered every one of her birthdays. You forgot mine 2 years in a row. Alara, don't be. I just want to know why. My voice rose, echoing in the vast space. Why did you marry me? He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I heard the truth before he said it. Celine went to Paris, he finally said, his tone defensive. I thought it was over. And you were brilliant. Ambitious. You came from a good family. You were suitable. The word hung in the air between us. Suitable. I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. A suitable substitute. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I looked at him, this stranger I had built my life around. You've had too much to drink. Go to sleep, Julian. I walked away, leaving him standing there. I heard him call my name, but I didn't turn back. Upstairs, in our pristine bedroom, I listened to the sound of him moving around downstairs, then finally coming up. He didn't come into the bedroom. He went to the guest room. The door closed. And finally, in the dark, alone, I let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. The game was over. And he had no idea I was just learning the rules. I didn't sleep. The tears dried into a hard, cold resolve that settled in the pit of my stomach. I lay in the center of our king-sized bed, in a room that felt like a museum exhibit of a happy marriage, and I planned. The hurt was still there, a raw, open wound, but it was now cauterized by a clear, focused fury. I was not just a victim. I was a strategist. He had forgotten that. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through the automated blinds, I was already in the kitchen. I moved on autopilot, the ghost of my former self. I toasted the artisanal bread, sliced the heirloom tomatoes, fried the organic free-range eggs exactly the way he liked them. The familiar sense of coffee and bacon filled the air, a cruel parody of domestic bliss. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, hesitant. He appeared in the doorway, dressed for the day in a crisp, custom-tailored shirt. He looked tired. He looked at me, then at the breakfast laid out on the marble island, and I saw the visible relaxation in his shoulders. The tension left his posture. He thought last night was a storm that had passed. He thought I was back in my box, the reasonable, understanding wife who would absorb his emotional negligence and call it love. "Smells good," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm not hungry," I said, my voice light, pleasant. I picked up my purse from the counter. "You can eat by yourself." His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Where are you going?" "To find a job," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "A job?" He looked genuinely perplexed, as if I'd said I was going to the moon. "Alara, that's not necessary. You don't need to work. Since I'm clearly not the wife you truly want," I said, the pleasant tone never wavering, "there's no need for me to keep playing the role of the devoted homemaker, is there?" "Alara." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. His tone was no longer neutral. It was laced with a low-grade panic. "What is this? What do you want?" I stopped at the doorway and turned back. "What do I want?" I let the mask slip for just a second, letting him see the ice in my eyes. "Julian, do you think I should be grateful? Thankful that the great Seo deigned to marry me? Thankful for this beautiful cage?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" I cut him off, my voice sharpening. "Do you think I should just turn a blind eye? Smile politely while you rekindle your romance with your first love?" His face darkened. "Celine and I are just friends." "Oh really?" I pulled out my phone and played Clara's video. I held it up so he could see his own tender gesture frozen on the screen. "Friends who wipe sauce off each other's mouths in dark corners of restaurants? Friends who meet in places where your wife can't see you." His eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. "You had someone follow me." His voice was low, dangerous. "I didn't need to," I said, a sarcastic laugh escaping my lips. "You two were so blatant even a stranger could see it. You weren't even trying to hide." The kitchen was engulfed in a deathly silence. The only sound was the hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. I was the one to break it. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping back to that terrifying calm. "Let's get a divorce." The word hung in the air, stark and final. "Impossible," he said, the word a flat, hard stone. "There's nothing wrong between us. Don't be unreasonable." "Nothing wrong." I let out a real laugh then, short and bitter. "Right. Of course not. After all, I'm just the stand-in. I'm not even qualified to be jealous, am I?" With that, I turned and walked out. I heard the sharp, explosive sound of his plate shattering against the wall behind me, but I didn't look back. Not once. Stepping out of the gated community, the morning sun felt alien on my skin. The tears came then, hot and furious, but I wiped them away with the back of my hand. They were the last tears he would ever get from me. I took out my phone and called Clara. "I need a lawyer," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "The best, most ruthless divorce lawyer you know." I went straight to Clara's office. As a partner at a prestigious law firm, her network was extensive. Within an hour, I was sitting in a sleek, modern conference room across from a woman named Diana Thorne. Her reputation preceded her. Sharp, meticulous, and merciless. "Are you sure about this, Alara?" Clara asked, her face etched with concern. "I know he's a bastard, but maybe you should try talking it out first? A scandal could." I shook my head. "There's nothing to talk about. A marriage without respect is just a slow-acting poison. I'm choosing the antidote." My phone rang. "Julian." I silenced it. A moment later, a text lit up the screen. "Honey, I'm sorry. I admit I've been getting too close to Celine lately, but it's just old classmates catching up. Come home. Let's talk properly." I showed the screen to Clara and Diana. "See?" I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "Now he's scared. Now he's meek. Men like him, Diana said, her voice cool and analytical, only capitulate when they're afraid of the financial or reputational hit. Once you cool off, they revert. They always do. I won't give him the chance to revert, I said. I opened my phone's photo album and found our wedding picture. We looked so radiant, so perfectly in love. My veil was blowing in the wind, and Julian was looking at me like I was the only woman in the world. Now I wondered, who was he really seeing in that moment? A suitable substitute for the woman he couldn't have? By 7 p.m., Diana had outlined a strategy. Mrs. Vance, she said, her fingers steepled, I strongly advise you to start gathering evidence of Mr. Vance's infidelity. Text messages, emails, photos, financial records of gifts to her. It will significantly strengthen your position regarding the division of assets and spousal support. I shook my head. No. I don't want to play the victim. I don't want to have to prove I was wrong to get what I deserve. I want a clean, swift break. An equal division of our marital assets. Nothing more, nothing less. Diana looked taken aback. With all due respect, that's incredibly generous to him. Given his net worth and the fact you sacrificed your career, you could demand a much larger settlement. You're entitled to it. I don't want his money, I said, and I meant it. I want my freedom. I want to look at myself in the mirror and know I didn't become a monster to defeat one. Just then my phone rang again. Julian. This time I answered. Alara, where are you? His voice was tight, strained. We need to talk. Properly. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my eyes on Diana. The divorce papers are being drafted. You can come and sign them whenever you're ready. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Come to the office, he said finally. There are some things we need to say face to face. I thought for a moment. All right, I said. I'll come now. After I hung up, Clara looked worried. Are you really going to go? He'll try to manipulate you. He'll turn on the charm. I'm going, I said, standing up and squaring my shoulders. But not to negotiate. I met her gaze. To declare war. The Vance Innovations Tower was a needle of glass and steel piercing the night sky. I stood outside the door to the CEO's office on the top floor, took a deep breath that felt like my first real breath in years, and pushed it open. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, looking out over the glittering city. Hearing the sound, he turned. The concern on his face was a masterclass in acting. Sweetheart. Just call me Alara, I interrupted him, my voice cool and even. I walked forward and placed the draft separation agreement Diana had just emailed me on his desk. Take a look. If there are no issues, sign it. He picked up the document, glanced at it, and tossed it back onto the desk as if it were garbage. Is there really no way to salvage this? He asked, his voice a low, persuasive rumble. Yes, I said, offering him a thin smile. After all, I'm just the substitute. What's there to salvage? You keep dwelling on this, he said, rubbing his temples in a show of exasperation. For 3 years of marriage, haven't I treated you well? Haven't I given you everything? Very well, I nodded. So well that I actually believed you loved me. That was the greatest gift of all, wasn't it? The illusion. Julian was silent for a moment, then he tried a new tactic. Celine is back in the country to develop her career. She needed connections. I was just helping her. It's business. So what? I sneered. Are you saying I shouldn't even be jealous of your business meetings? That's not what I meant. Julian, I cut him off, my patience evaporating. Do you know what I hate the most? It's not that you're sneaking around with your ex. It's that you treated me like I was a fool. That you thought I was too stupid, too blinded by this life, to ever figure it out. As I spoke, I took out my phone. I pulled up screenshots I'd spent the early hours compiling. 2 months ago, dinner at the Gilded Oyster. A month ago, you accompanied her to view apartments in the Heritage District. The day before yesterday, you purchased a limited edition Birkin bag. Price: $130,000. Delivered to her suite at the Peninsula. Julian's face turned to stone. You've been tracking my expenses. No need, I said, the smile returning to my lips. She posted a photo of every single gift on her social media. He tagged the locations, the brands. She was practically sending me an invitation. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? I took a step closer to him. All this time the two of you have been so blatant. And I kept waiting. I waited for you to feel guilty. I waited for you to come to me and come clean. Elara, let me explain. No more explanations, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Right now, all you need to tell me is whether you will sign the papers or not. Suddenly he moved. He crossed the space between us in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms. His grip was like iron. I'm not divorcing you, he growled into my hair. Let go of me, I said, my voice cold. I won't. His arms tightened. Elara, you're my wife. We've had a good life these past 3 years, haven't we? We can fix this. Good. I struggled against him, then went still. Yes, it must have been great for you. Having your caring, dutiful wife waiting at home while you kept your first love on the side. Who wouldn't love that arrangement? I admit I've been too close to Celine lately, he murmured, his voice softening into that familiar, persuasive tone that had once made me melt. It was a moment of weakness. A mistake. Give me another chance. Please. I raised my head and looked straight into his eyes, into the depths of his deception. Julian, I said slowly, clearly. Do you think I'm an idiot? What? No. That Celine Rossi, I sneered, has been hovering around you since the day we got married. For 3 years, every time you said you were working late, you were with her, weren't you? He stiffened slightly. A tiny, almost imperceptible tell. Do you think I didn't know? I continued, pressing my advantage. Last year on my birthday, you said you had an emergency meeting with investors from Tokyo. But you were actually with her at the opening of that modern art exhibit, weren't you? His face lost all its color. You knew. All this time you knew. Of course I knew, I said, finally wrenching my wrist free from his grasp. I was just lying to myself. I thought if I was perfect enough, if I loved you enough, you'd eventually look at me and see me and not her shadow. I took a step back, putting space between us. The fight suddenly went out of me, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. But now I understand. It was never possible. Because in your heart I was never the first choice. I was just suitable. That's not true, he said, but the words sounded hollow, automatic. I do love you. Love me. I let out a dry, brittle laugh. The way you loved the idea of marrying me? Because I was appropriate? Because I came from the right family and wouldn't embarrass you at corporate functions? He had no answer. He just stood there, a handsome, powerful man who had been caught in his own web and couldn't find a way out. Julian, I said, the weariness seeping into my voice. I'm tired. So very tired. I turned toward the door. I'll have my lawyer send the final papers over. Just sign them when you're ready. Wait. The word was sharp, desperate. Give me some time. A week. Let me sort things out with Celine. Properly. Then we can talk. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob but didn't turn back. No, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. I've given you 3 years. I'm all out of time. I walked out, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of something heavy, a paperweight perhaps, shattering against it followed me down the hall. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking, my head high toward the elevators, toward my freedom. Stepping out of the sterile, air-conditioned building into the night air was like being born again. A light, misting rain was falling and I stood on the curb, letting it soak into my hair and my clothes, washing away the residue of that office, of that marriage. My phone vibrated. An unknown number. An area code I recognized as the city's wealthy enclave. I answered. Hello. Elara Vance? A smooth, melodic voice said. It's Celine Rossi. Long time no see. Think we should talk. Are you free? The lounge at the Peninsula. Now. The rain felt like a baptism. Each drop that hit my skin was a tiny shock, a reminder that I was alive, that I was feeling something other than the numb, curated existence of being Mrs. Julian Vance. I stood there, soaked to the bone, watching the headlights of cars streak through the wet darkness. Celine's voice, that carefully cultivated blend of sweetness and condescension, still echoed in my ear. The Peninsula. No. She didn't ask. He summoned. And the old Elara, the one who had just wanted to keep the peace, would have politely declined. But that woman had died in Julian's office. Her final breath used to say, I'm all out of time. I hailed a cab. The driver gave my drenched state a dubious look, but I slid into the back seat and gave him the address with a tone that brooked no argument. As the city blurred past the rain-streaked window, I didn't plan. I didn't rehearse. I just let the cold fury settle into a sharp, focused point. This was reconnaissance. I was going to look the enemy in the eye. The peninsula was a world of hushed tones, gleaming brass, and the faint scent of expensive perfume. I, in my rain-plastered hair and simple dress, was a discordant note in its symphony of wealth. I didn't care. I walked through the lobby as if I owned it, my squelching flats leaving faint damp marks on the pristine carpet. I spotted her immediately, a vision in cream silk, nestled in a plush armchair in a secluded corner of the lounge. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a spa, not a tense confrontation. "Elara," she said, not bothering to stand. A faint, pitying smile played on her lips as she took in my appearance. "Please have a seat. Can I order you something? Something to warm you up." Her concern was a weapon, designed to highlight my dishevelment and her own perfect composure. "No," I said, sitting down opposite her. The chair was deep and soft, trying to swallow me whole. I perched on the edge, back straight. "Just say what you have to say." She sighed, a little performance of regret, and took a delicate sip of her drink, something clear and cold with a twist of lime. "I heard you're causing quite a stir for Julian. Threatening divorce over a simple misunderstanding." I remained silent, just watching her. My stillness unnerved her. I saw the slightest flicker in her perfectly made-up eyes. "Given his stature," she continued, setting her glass down with a precise click, "untangling assets will be a nightmare. And so public. It's also messy." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was just thinking. There's no need for all this unpleasantness." I raised an eyebrow. "No. Of course not." She smiled, a predator's smile. "How about we make a deal? You play nice. You sign whatever papers his lawyers put in front of you, walk away with whatever pittance they initially offer. And to make it worth your while," she paused for effect, "I'll give you 3 million. A clean break. No fuss. It's more than enough for you to disappear and live comfortably." I stared at her. The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to buy me off, to pay me to vanish from her narrative. She thought my marriage, my pain, my entire existence had a price tag. And a cheap one at that. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I didn't say anything for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for her. "Miss Rossi," I said finally, my voice low and steady, "are you misunderstanding something?" Her smile tightened. "What do you mean?" "I don't want a divorce because I'm trying to extort money from my husband or from you," I said, leaning forward now, mirroring her posture. "I want a divorce because I have finally realized that Julian Vance is a pathetic, disloyal man who isn't worth the ground I walk on. And frankly," I let my eyes sweep over her with deliberate disdain, "I look down on both of you." Her mask slipped. A flash of genuine anger sparked in her eyes. "Elara, don't be ungrateful. This is a generous offer. You'd be wise to take it." "Ungrateful." I let out a soft, incredulous laugh. I stood up, looking down at her where she sat, her composure finally cracking. "I'd like to see which one of us is truly being ungrateful. You swoop back into a married man's life, and you have the gall to offer me money to go away? You're not the victim here. You're the cliché." Her face was now pale with rage. She opened her mouth to retort, but I didn't give her the chance. "The game," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "has only just begun." I turned and walked away, leaving her speechless in her silk nest. I didn't look back. As I passed through the opulent lobby, I slipped my hand into my pocket and stopped the recording on my phone. The entire conversation, from her condescending greeting to her attempted bribe, was now preserved. Digital insurance. The cab ride home was a blur. My mind was no longer racing. It was calculating. Julian thought he could love-bomb me into submission. Celine thought she could buy me off. They both profoundly underestimated me. They saw the wife, the hostess, the caregiver. They didn't see the strategist. They didn't see the survivor. When I got home, the house was dark. Julian wasn't back yet. Good. I took a hot shower, washing the feel of the peninsula and Celine's smugness off my skin. I changed into simple pajamas and went downstairs. I needed him to think the storm had passed. I needed him to feel safe, to let his guard down. I heard his key in the door around midnight. He came in quietly, looking weary and defeated. When he saw me sitting calmly on the sofa, reading a book, the relief on his face was palpable. He thought he'd won. "Elara," he said, his voice cautious. "You're still up." "I was waiting for you," I said, marking my page and setting the book aside. I patted the space next to me. "Come, sit." He looked surprised, but hope flickered in his eyes. He obediently sat down, leaving a careful foot of space between us. "About today," he began, his voice laced with a practiced remorse. "At the office. I wanted to explain." "No need to explain," I said, cutting him off gently. I shifted closer to him, letting my shoulder brush against his. I saw him tense, then slowly relax at the contact. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I figured it out." He turned to me, a cautious hope blooming on his face. "Figured what out?" "The problem between us," I said, looking into his eyes, letting my own gaze soften into something resembling forgiveness. "You were right. These 3 years have been good. I overreacted. Threatening divorce over a momentary lapse in judgment. It was impulsive. I forced the words out, each one tasting like ash, but my performance was flawless." The relief that washed over him was so complete it was almost childlike. He reached for my hand. "Oh, Lara. Honey, you finally understand." "Yes," I said, letting a small, contrite smile touch my lips. "I understand." I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder, feeling him stiffen again before his arm came up to wrap around me. The gesture felt alien, grotesque. "So," I said, my voice soft and pleading, "can you promise me one thing?" "Anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was so eager for absolution, so pathetically grateful to have his comfortable life handed back to him. "I want to go back to work," I said. "I heard Vance Innovations is hiring in the marketing department. I'd like to apply. I need to get out of this house. I need to feel like my own person again." His arm tightened around me. "Elara, there's no need. I can support you. I want to support you." "I know," I said, nuzzling against his chest, playing the part of the chastened wife seeking purpose. "But I want to prove to everyone, to myself, that I'm not just an accessory. That I'm more than just your wife." He was silent for a moment. I could almost hear the calculations in his head. The marketing department was harmless. It was far from the core of his operations. It was a placating gesture, a bone he could throw to keep me quiet. "All right," he said finally, kissing the top of my head. "If it means that much to you, I'll have HR arrange it tomorrow." "Thank you, darling," I said, tilting my head up to kiss his cheek. His skin felt cold. "I'm going to take a shower." I extricated myself from his embrace and walked upstairs. In the bathroom, I locked the door and stared at my reflection in the steam-fogged mirror. The woman looking back had cool, determined eyes. "Julian," I thought, the words a silent vow in the humid air. "You like to play games. You think you've won this round. But you just let the Trojan horse inside your gates. Now let the real game begin." The woman in the mirror was a stranger and I liked her. Her eyes held a cold fire the old Elara's never had. She had just performed a flawless act of contrition and the audience, my husband, had bought every word. The shower steam couldn't warm the chill of calculation that had settled in my bones. This was no longer about hurt feelings, it was a campaign. I went to bed beside a man I no longer recognized, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, a sound that had once been my lullaby and now felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to his oblivion. I didn't sleep. I planned. The next morning I played my part. I made coffee. I buttered his toast. I was quieter, subdued, the perfectly believable portrait of a wife who was sorry for making a scene. Julian watched me, a satisfied gleam in his eye. He saw my request to work as a capitulation, a way for me to find a hobby to keep me busy and out of his hair. He had no idea he was handing me the keys to his kingdom. I walked into Vance Innovations 2 days later. The glass tower felt different now. It wasn't Julian's monument. It was my chessboard. HR, forewarned by the CEO himself, was obsequiously efficient. I was given a title, marketing associate, and a small windowless office that was clearly a converted supply closet. It was meant to be a dismissal, a place to shunt me where I could do no harm. It was perfect. My team was a group of bright, young, slightly intimidated people who knew exactly who I was. The boss's wife. Their conversations halted when I entered the break room. I made a point of being humble, eager to learn, and slightly out of my depth. I brought in pastries. I asked for their help with the printer. I was building a persona, one they would never see as a threat. Meanwhile, I began to dig. Julian had given me access to the company's internal network, a perfunctory gesture. "Feel free to look around, get a feel for the place," he'd said, never imagining I would. I started with the project directories. And there it was, glowing on my screen, the Azure Heights development. A massive, multi-billion-dollar waterfront real estate project. The crown jewel in Vance Innovations' portfolio. And the listed project liaison, Celine Rossi. Of course. It wasn't just old flames and stolen kisses. It was business. Their business. I began pulling every file, every email chain, every budget report associated with Azure Heights. I cross-referenced dates with Julian's business trips and Celine's social media posts. It was all there. A digital paper trail of their deception masquerading as corporate enterprise. And then I found it. The first crack. The land acquisition documents for Azure Heights were messy. There was a shell company, a flurry of permits that seemed rushed, an environmental survey that had been controversially fast-tracked. The original landowner was a reclusive old family, the Blackwoods. The sale price seemed low. Suspiciously low. A deep, cold satisfaction settled in my stomach. This was no longer just about an affair. This was about corruption. This was the leverage I needed. I picked up my phone and called Clara. "I need a deep dive," I said, my voice low despite my empty office. "Celine Rossi. I need everything. Academic records, previous employment, financials. Especially her connection to a family called the Blackwoods." Clara, to her credit, didn't ask questions. On it. The information came back in less than an hour. It was more explosive than I could have hoped for. Celine Rossi's master's from the Sorbonne was elegant fiction, purchased from a diploma mill. Her extensive experience in European real estate consisted of a brief, failed internship. And the connection to the Blackwoods? She wasn't just their liaison. She was the longtime mistress of Arthur Blackwood, the frail, elderly patriarch of the family. A man 40 years her senior. The pieces snapped into place with an almost audible click. Celine had used her relationship with the old man to strong-arm the family into selling the land to Julian's company at a bargain price. She was the key that unlocked the Azure Heights project. No wonder Julian was so eager to please her. She wasn't just his first love, she was his golden goose. I was printing out a particularly damning email when my office door opened without a knock. Celine stood there, leaning against the doorframe, a smirk on her perfectly painted lips. She was dressed for power, a sharp white pantsuit that screamed both money and entitlement. "Alara," she purred. "I heard you joined the ranks. How quaint." I slowly finished stacking my papers, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Miss Rossi, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Here to inspect my filing skills." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The small room suddenly felt smaller. "I'm here to offer some advice. Work is work. Keep your personal disappointments out of it. Don't get the wrong idea about why you're here." I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze head-on. "And what idea is that? Did you think I came here to keep an eye on Julian?" I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "No. I'm here to see how long a person can keep jumping around before the branch they're standing on finally breaks." Her smirk faltered. "Are you threatening me?" "I wouldn't dare," I said, my voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm just curious. What do you think would happen if Julian found out his key project liaison secured her biggest deal not through business acumen, but by being a geriatrics mistress?" The color drained from her face. The mask of confidence shattered, replaced by raw panic. "You wouldn't." "Try me," I said softly. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a new, dawning fear. She had seen the mouse, and now she was realizing she'd let a viper into the house. Without another word, she turned and left, her retreat noticeably less graceful than her entrance. The encounter left me buzzing with adrenaline. The game was accelerating. That evening, Julian was waiting for me by the car. He seemed almost cheerful. "How was the first day?" he asked, opening the passenger door for me. "Enlightening," I said, sliding in. He got in and started the engine. "Listen, about today, did you, happen to see Celine?" I looked out the window at the passing city. "She stopped by. Wanted to give me some workplace tips." Mostly told me to stay away from you. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. She shouldn't have said that. It's fine, I said, my tone light, dismissive. I don't care. I turned to look at his profile. We're all adults here. We can be professional. He glanced at me, a flicker of surprise and what looked like disappointment in his eyes. He wanted jealousy. He wanted proof that I still cared. My indifference was a weapon he didn't know how to counter. The car stopped in front of our usual steakhouse. What are you in the mood for? He asked. Surprise me, I said. By the way, how's the Azure Heights project coming along? He paused, his hand on the door handle. Smoothly. Why the sudden interest? No reason, I smiled, taking his arm. Just heard it's the company's biggest project this year. I hope it's everything you dreamed it would be. He looked at me, a faint line of suspicion between his brows. Don't worry. With Celine on it, it's in good hands. Is that so? I said, my voice laced with a meaning he couldn't possibly decipher. I hope so. Dinner was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive theater. I asked polite questions about work, praised the food and smiled at all the right moments. I was the perfect supportive wife. And the entire time I could feel the weight of the evidence burning a hole in my purse. The forged documents, the emails, the photos of Celine and the ancient Mr. Blackwood. I was no longer just a wronged wife. I was a spy in the house of love, and I had just found the secret that could bring the whole damn thing crashing down. The steakhouse felt like a stage. Every clink of silverware, every murmur of conversation, was part of a play where I was the only one who knew the final act. Julian relaxed with every bite, with every sip of expensive red wine, believing he had navigated the crisis. He saw my questions about Azure Heights as wifely interest, my indifference to Celine as surrender. His arrogance was a blanket, smothering any instinct that might have warned him he was dining with a predator. I played my part to perfection. I laughed at his jokes. I nodded at his stories. And all the while the files on Celine Rossi, the fake diploma, the financial records linking her to Arthur Blackwood, the damning project emails, existed like a live wire in my mind. The next week was a study in controlled tension. I went to my closet-sized office every day. I attended marketing meetings about product launches and social media engagement, contributing just enough to seem engaged. I was a ghost in the machine and my haunting was methodical, silent. My focus was the marketing budget for Azure Heights. It was a backdoor, a way to see the financial flow without raising alarms. The numbers were staggering. Millions were being funneled into consultancy fees and vendor liaison costs, all tied to shell companies that, after some late-night digging, traced back to an offshore account I was certain belonged to Celine. Julian wasn't just sleeping with her. He was bankrolling her, using his company's flagship project as their personal piggy bank. The sheer scale of the betrayal was no longer personal. It was criminal. It solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about my broken heart anymore. It was about justice. I needed to act. I couldn't unleash this myself. It needed to come from an independent, credible source. It was time to bring in the outside world. I called an old contact from my banking days, David Chin. He was an investigative journalist now, hungry for a big break. We met at a quiet, unassuming cafe miles from the financial district. Alara Vance, he said, sliding into the booth opposite me. This is a surprise. I heard you'd retired to a life of luxury. Luxury can be a gilded cage, David, I said, pushing a manila folder across the table. I think you'll find what's in here enlightening. He opened the folder, his professional curiosity quickly morphing into wide-eyed astonishment. He scanned the documents, the land deal summaries, the emails between Julian and Celine discussing bonus payments, the photos of Celine with the elderly Blackwood, the damning proof of her fabricated credentials. Holy hell, he whispered, looking up at me. This is massive. The Azure Heights project? It's the darling of the commercial real estate world. If this is true. It's all true, I said, my voice calm. 100%. And I have more. I sent the video files from my phone to his. The restaurant clip Clara had sent me, and the audio recording of Celine trying to bribe me at the peninsula. David's eyes were like saucers. He looked from the files to me, a new respect dawning in his gaze. Alara, are you sure? This will create an earthquake. It'll destroy him. It'll destroy the company. I took a sip of my coffee. It was bitter and perfect. I'm counting on it. He hesitated. Aren't you afraid of him? Of the repercussions? I smiled, a thin, cold expression. What's there to be afraid of? We're already getting a divorce. The following morning the earthquake hit. I was at my desk, pretending to analyze demographic data, when the first notification popped up on my phone. Then another. And another. The news exploded across every major financial and mainstream outlet. Vance Innovations' billion-dollar project under cloud of corruption, Azure Heights land deal questioned. Project director's past exposed, Celine Rossi. Faked credentials, alleged impropriety with real estate tycoon Arthur Blackwood, exclusive video. Vance Rossi intimate dinner raises ethical concerns. The office outside my door, which had been a hum of low activity, fell into a stunned silence, followed by a rising wave of frantic whispers. Phones started ringing off the hook. I sat perfectly still, watching the chaos unfold on my screen and through the slats of my blinds. It was like conducting a symphony of ruin. Then my door burst open. Celine stood there, but the powerful, polished executive was gone. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wild with a panicked fury. She looked like a cornered animal. You, she shrieked, lunging into my office. You did this. You psychotic bitch. She made a grab for me, her nails aimed at my face. I stood up and sidestepped her effortlessly. She stumbled against my desk, sending a stack of papers flying. Ms. Rossi, I said, my voice cold and steady. I'd appreciate it if you'd mind your manners. And for the record, I didn't write those articles. You, she trembled, pointing a shaking finger at me. You've ruined me. Do you have any idea what you've done? I have a fairly good idea, I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. But before you have your next meltdown, you might want to think about how you're going to explain those photos and videos to the board. Or to the police. The color drained completely from her face. The anger was replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. She stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time, not as the meek wife but as the architect of her destruction. Without another word, she turned and fled, her heels clicking a desperate, retreating tattoo on the polished floor. It wasn't long before the next visitor arrived. Julian didn't knock. He simply threw the door open, his face a terrifying mask of thunderous rage. The calm, controlled CEO was utterly gone. Was it you? He snarled, his voice low and venomous. He slammed a printed copy of a news headline on my desk. Did you feed this to the press? I didn't flinch. I met his glare with icy calm. Not me, I said, blinking slowly. I merely provided some evidence I uncovered to journalists who were already asking questions. As an employee of Vance Innovations, I felt it was my duty to ensure the company's reputation was protected from internal threats. Protected? He roared, slamming his fist on the desk. The computer monitor jumped. Do you have any idea the damage this will cause? The stock is in free fall. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. Then I suppose you should blame your project director, I said, tilting my head. She's the one who used such creative methods to secure the project. I didn't tell her to sleep with a senior citizen to get a deal. Julian fell silent, his chest heaving. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost. The pieces were finally connecting in his head. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice a strained whisper. What is it you actually want, Ilara? What do I want? I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I want to remind certain people that not everyone in this world can be used and discarded. I want you to understand that the suitable wife you married has teeth. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the end of the day, Celine Rossi was officially terminated. News vans camped outside the Blackwood estate. Arthur Blackwood, humiliated and reportedly ill, issued a statement through his lawyers severing all ties with Celine and launching an internal investigation into the land sale. Vance Innovations' stock price plummeted, wiping millions off the company's valuation. I stood by my windowless office wall, listening to the panicked shouts echoing from the executive floor. A cold smile curled my lips. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. When I got home that night, Julian was already there, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. The house was dark. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Is this what you wanted? He asked, his voice ragged. To destroy everything I've built? I walked over to him, not with sympathy, but with the cool assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. "This isn't destruction, Julian," I said, my voice soft but firm. "This is consequence." I placed a hand on his shoulder. It was rigid with tension. "I'm just helping you clean house. Someone like Celine, she was a liability waiting to happen." He shook my hand off violently. "Ilara, when did you become so ruthless?" "Ruthless?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. I picked up the whiskey bottle and poured myself a finger, something I never did. "Then what do you call 3 years of lies? What do you call sneaking around with your mistress while I ironed your shirts? Was that not ruthless?" He had no answer. He just stared into the bottom of his glass. "I'm going to bed," I said, setting my untouched drink down. "You should too. The board meeting tomorrow will require you to be at your best." As I walked up the stairs, I could feel his gaze burning into my back. He was finally afraid. Not of losing me, but of me. And I knew with a certainty that chilled my soul that the game was far from over. I had drawn first blood. But cornered animals are the most dangerous ones. I had to be ready for his counterattack. The quiet of the house was suddenly oppressive, filled with the unspoken promise of a war that was about to escalate. The silence in the house that night was a living thing, thick and heavy with the aftershock of ruin. I lay in the dark, not sleeping, listening to the occasional clink of glass from downstairs. Julian was drowning his shock and fury in whiskey. I could almost taste the bitterness of it in the air. The news cycle was a relentless drumbeat of Vance Innovations' implosion, and I, the architect of it all, felt a serene, terrifying calm. The next morning, the board meeting was a bloodbath I watched from the sidelines. From my tiny office, I monitored the company's internal chat, a river of panicked speculation. Julian emerged hours later, pale and grim, his aura of invincibility visibly cracked. The board had given him an ultimatum: contain the Azure Heights disaster or face a vote of no confidence. His response was not surrender. It was a pivot. A desperate, arrogant gambit. A new proposal was circulated by afternoon. Azure Heights would continue, but with a new vetted and reputable partner, Omnicorp Developments. The name meant nothing to anyone at first glance. It was bland, corporate, innocuous. But something about it prickled at the back of my neck. It was too clean, too convenient. I stayed late again, the ghost in the machine. While the office emptied out, I dug. Omnicorp was a newly formed LLC, its paperwork a masterpiece of obfuscation. But I had spent 3 years managing a household and decoding Julian's evasions. Untangling corporate knots was child's play in comparison. I followed the digital breadcrumbs through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore holdings, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. And then I found him. Buried beneath layers of legal fiction was the majority shareholder of Omnicorp, Arthur Blackwood's nephew, a notoriously unscrupulous financier named Marcus Blackwood. And the silent partner, the one providing the capital and the expertise? None other than Wang Ming, the same real estate tycoon Celine had been entangled with. Julian hadn't cut ties, he'd just given the snake a new skin. He thought he was so clever. He thought he could play me and the board for fools. A cold, furious laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the empty office. The arrogance was breathtaking. He was so deep in his own corruption he couldn't even see a way out anymore. He could only double down. The next shareholder meeting was a performance of corporate normalcy. I attended as Julian's wife, the picture of supportive grace in a tasteful navy dress. I sat in the front row, a serene smile plastered on my face as Julian took the podium. He was brilliant. Chastened but resilient. He spoke of learning from setbacks, of due diligence, and of the promising new partnership with Omnicorp. I watched him, this man I had once loved, weave his web of lies with such effortless charm. He believed his own performance. He believed he could talk his way out of anything. After the meeting, I cornered him in the now empty conference room. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city he was trying to swindle. "That proposal," I said without preamble. "The one with Omnicorp. Don't you think there's something familiar about it?" He turned, his mask of weary triumph slipping for a second. "What are you talking about?" "It's a new partner. A fresh start. A new name," I corrected, my voice dropping to a whisper. "But the same old players. Marcus Blackwood. And of course his good friend Wang Ming. Did you really think a coat of paint would fix a rotten foundation?" His face went deathly pale. All the color drained away, leaving behind a stark, terrified mask. You've been investigating me. The words were barely a breath. Not investigating, I said, stepping closer until I could see the panic in his eyes. Just paying attention. You've gotten sloppy, Julian. Or maybe you just always thought I was too stupid to notice. I took out my phone. Guess what this is? I didn't wait for an answer. I played an audio clip one of many Claire's PI had managed to acquire. It was a conversation between Wang Ming and a city official, their voices low and smug, discussing kickbacks and fast-tracked permits for the new Azure Heights partnership. Julian's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip like a vice. What do you want to do? He hissed, his face inches from mine. The smell of his fear was sharp and acrid. I've said it before, I said, my voice glacial, not flinching from his grip. I'm doing this for the company. Partners like this will only bury you. And I won't let you take my future down with you. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine for some trace of the woman he'd married. He found only ice. Ilara, he whispered, a broken sound. You've changed. You weren't like this before. Yeah, I said, finally wrenching my hand free. I was naive before. I trusted you. But now, I let the sentence hang heavy with implication. Now I only trust evidence. I turned to leave. By the way, I've already submitted this particular piece of evidence to the relevant authorities. You might want to think about how you're going to explain it to the board. Again. I didn't look back. I walked out, leaving him standing there, surrounded by glass and the crumbling ruins of his empire. The hammer fell the next day. Wang Ming was arrested for fraud and bribery at his luxury penthouse, a spectacle captured by news cameras. The stock, which had been struggling to stabilize, went into a terminal nosedive. Billions in market value evaporated before the opening bell had even finished ringing. I sat in my office watching the numbers freefall on my screen. There was no joy in it, no thrill. Just a cold, grim satisfaction. The poison was being purged. My phone buzzed. It was Claire. It's done, she said, her voice a mix of awe and fear. How much? With the stock this low, she replied. We've acquired 20% of the outstanding shares. You're now the second largest shareholder. A real smile, the first genuine one in months, touched my lips. Good. Hanging up, I walked to the window of my closet office, staring at the blank wall. 3 years ago, I'd stood at the altar, believing I was the luckiest woman in the world. Now I was orchestrating the downfall of the man I'd vowed to love forever. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. When I got home that evening, Julian was waiting for me in the living room, the whiskey bottle now empty on the table. The room was dark, the only light coming from the city outside. He looked ancient, all his polished charm stripped away, leaving a hollowed-out shell. Is this your goal? He asked, his voice raspy and raw. He didn't look at me, just stared at the plummeting stock chart on his tablet. Taking advantage of the crash to buy up shares? To seize control. I walked over and stood behind his chair. Isn't this what you taught me? I said, my voice soft but clear in the gloom. The business world is a battlefield. You seize every opportunity. He turned then, his eyes blazing with a helpless fury. Ilara, when did you become so cold? Cold. I let the word hang in the air for a moment before I moved around the chair to face him. Then what do you call what you did? Sneaking around with Celine for years, funding her life with company money, making me a laughingstock? Was that not cold? He had no retort. He just shook his head, a broken man. Don't be angry, I said, reaching out and placing my hands on his shoulders. He flinched at my touch. I'm just helping you clean up your mess. Someone like Wang Ming. He was a catastrophe waiting to happen. He shrugged my hands off violently. Ilara, get away from me. I didn't move. By the way, I said, my tone conversational. I've had my lawyer draft a new divorce agreement. It'll be delivered to the company tomorrow. You should take a look. He shot to his feet, the tablet clattering to the floor. What did you say? Divorce. I repeated, the word simple and final. What? Unwilling? Or would you prefer I share what I know about your little Omnicorp scheme with the next wave of reporters? I'm sure they'd love to know how the CEO of Vance Innovations tried to cover up one scandal with an even bigger one. His face was a sickly white. The threat hung between us, undeniable and devastating. Don't look so nervous, I said, taking a step closer. As long as you cooperate, this evidence stays with me. But if you dare try to play games with the settlement. I let out a soft, cold laugh. You know what happens. I left him standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the expensive, empty artifacts of our failed life. The king was in check. And his queen was done playing by his rules. The end game was in sight, and for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I would be the one left standing. 3 days. For 72 hours, the silence in the house was a physical presence. A third occupant in our cold, beautiful mausoleum. Julian became a ghost, drifting from room to room, speaking to no one, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from panicked investors and furious board members. I watched him from a distance, this man who had once seemed to hold the sun in his hands, now shrinking under the weight of his own decay. I, on the other hand, felt a surreal sense of calm. The storm I had unleashed was raging outside these walls, but inside I was the I. I spent my days at the company not in my closet, but in a temporary office they'd given me. A larger one with a view. The staff looked at me differently now. Not with pity or curiosity, but with a wary, newfound respect. They didn't know the full story, but they knew the CEO's wife was the one who hadn't flinched when the sky fell. On the morning of the third day, a courier arrived at the house. I signed for the thick, legal-sized envelope. Inside was the signed copy of the divorce agreement. Julian had scrawled his name on the final page with a furious, jagged signature that looked like it had torn the paper. He'd agreed to everything. An equal division of our liquid assets. No fight over the house, which I didn't want anyway. And the crown jewel. The transfer of 20% of Vance Innovations shares to me, making me the second largest shareholder. He hadn't even tried to negotiate. The threat of the Omnicorp evidence had been a gun to his head and he'd folded. The fight had gone out of him. The king had resigned. I held the papers in my hands, their weight feeling insignificant compared to the monumental shift they represented. This was it. My freedom. My victory. But the taste of it was ash. There was no triumph, only a vast, hollow exhaustion. The press, smelling blood in the water, went into a frenzy. The narrative of the amicable split between Julian Vance and his wife was a thin veneer over the spectacle of his corporate collapse. We issued sterile joint statements crafted by lawyers, and I stayed out of sight, letting the storm swirl around him. Celine, however, could not stay out of sight. That afternoon she stormed into my new office. The polished veneer was gone, completely stripped away. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her clothes looked like she'd slept in them. She was a portrait of utter ruin. "Elara," she spat, her voice trembling with a volatile mix of rage and desperation. "Are you happy now? You got what you wanted, didn't you? You got your money. Now that you're rich, why can't you just stop?" I set down the pen I was holding and looked at her, truly looked at her. The innocence, the charm, it was all gone, burned away by exposure and failure. All that was left was a desperate, bitter core. "Happy?" I repeated, my voice flat. "What do you mean, happy? You just wanted the money, didn't you?" she sneered, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "You never loved him. You were just waiting for a payday. Well, you've got it. So why don't you just disappear?" I stood up slowly, a cold smile touching my lips. "Ms. Rossi, are you misunderstanding something?" Her face contorted. "What am I misunderstanding? You've destroyed my life. My career is over. My reputation is garbage." "It was never about the money," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I took a step toward her. "It was about revenge." She took an involuntary step back, hitting the edge of a chair. What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, stopping just in front of her, "that this isn't over. Did you think this was the end? Well, this is just the beginning." Her bravado cracked, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. "What else do you want? What more could you possibly take from me?" "Nothing much," I said, my smile widening. "I just want some people to understand that this world isn't a place anyone can trample on as they please." I picked up my phone from the desk. "By the way, would you like a preview? I have a new video. You and Wang Ming. The conversation is quite illuminating." The blood drained from her face so completely I thought she might faint. She stared at me, her mouth agape, finally comprehending the depth of the hole she was in. I wasn't just a scorned wife. I was an avenging angel, and my wrath was boundless. She turned and fled without another word, her flight desperate and uncoordinated. A week later, the new video hit the internet. It was worse than the first. Grainy but clear, it showed Celine and Wang Ming in a private club, their heads close together. They weren't being romantic. They were discussing business. Specifically, how to leverage Julian's desperation to gain even more control over the Azure Heights project, and how to funnel funds through Marcus Blackwood's new shell companies. They were laughing about how easy it was to manipulate a love-struck fool. It was the final nail in the coffin. Julian couldn't protect her this time. He could barely protect himself. I watched the news from my hotel room. I'd moved out of the house immediately after the papers were signed. Celine was arrested for conspiracy and fraud. Wang Ming, already in custody, faced a slew of new charges. The footage was everywhere. Her humiliation was complete, a public evisceration. That evening there was a knock on my hotel room door. I wasn't surprised. I opened it to find Julian standing there. He looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were hollow caves. "Are you really going to take this to the absolute extreme?" he asked, his voice weary beyond measure. He didn't wait for an invitation. He just walked in and sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. I closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. What else should I do? Pretend it never happened? Issue another statement wishing them well? Ilara. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know I was wrong. I know I failed you. But this scorched earth policy, it's not good for anyone." I let out a short, sharp laugh. "You're wrong. It's very good for me. It's cathartic. It's the only thing that's felt good in 3 years." He was silent for a long time, just staring at the floor. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, the words so quiet I almost didn't hear them. "No need to apologize," I said, pushing off from the door. "We're even now." I picked up my suitcase, which was already half-packed. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to start." "Wait," he said, the word bursting out of him. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the man I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, lost. "Do you really not love me at all anymore?" I stopped with my hand on the suitcase handle but didn't turn around. "Julian," I said, my voice soft but unwavering. "Have you ever wondered what things would be like now if you had truly cherished me back then?" The silence from behind me was his answer. "What a pity," I said, finally turning to face him. I gave him a smile that held no warmth, only a profound, final sadness. "You gave me a beautiful, empty sham of a marriage. And I'm returning the favor with a perfectly executed revenge. I'd say that makes us even." I walked out of the room, pulling the suitcase behind me. I didn't look back. I rode the elevator down, walked through the pristine lobby and stepped out into the cool evening air. I was free. I was wealthy. I was alone. Half a year passed. Celine and Wang Ming were both convicted and sentenced to prison. Vance Innovations, hobbled and humiliated, was acquired by a rival tech firm in a fire sale. Julian vanished from the public eye, a broken man. I sold my shares, liquidated everything and reinvested the capital into a series of quiet, successful startups. I'd learned more about business and ruthlessness in my marriage than any MBA could ever teach. I was in a new apartment, packing the last of my boxes for a move overseas, when Claire came to see me. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she held her phone. "Ilara," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you hear?" "Hear what?" I asked, taping a box shut. "Julian. He went to the prison. To see Celine. There was an argument. A guard said it was violent. He had a shiv. He stabbed her. Multiple times." Clara's words tumbled out, choked and horrified. "And then he turned it on himself. They're both dead." My hand paused on the cardboard box. The air left the room. I saw his face that last night in the hotel room, the hollow eyes, the utter despair. I had taken everything from him. His company, his reputation, his freedom, his mistress. I had left him with nothing. Not even a reason to live. I finished taping the box. The sound of the ripping tape was loud in the silent room. "Oh," I said, my voice perfectly even. "Is that all?" Clara stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning horror. My God. He's dead. They're both dead. Don't you feel anything?" I turned and looked at her, my best friend, the one person who had stood by me. I saw the fear in her eyes. The fear of me. What's there to feel? I asked, stacking the box neatly against the wall. He was a man who deceived me for 3 years. He made his choices. I wiped a speck of dust from my jeans. Dead is dead. Elara, that's enough. Clara's voice was sharp, a plea and a condemnation. I cut her off. Clara, help me book a plane ticket. I think I'll go to Italy first. Or maybe Greece. I need to clear my head. Where to? She asked, her voice numb. Anywhere, I said, walking to the window and looking out at the city skyline, a skyline he had once owned. After all, life must go on. And it would. But as I stood there, I finally understood the cost of my victory. The pain of betrayal, the searing heat of hypocrisy, they weren't just memories. They were etched into my bones, a permanent frost that nothing could ever melt. People always say the best revenge is living well, is forgetting. But I could never forget. So I had chosen the other path. I had chosen to make everyone who hurt me pay the price. And as for Julian's final bloody act, that was his choice. His last, desperate move in a game I had already won. Everyone must take responsibility for their own choices. And I, Elara Vance, was finally free to start my new one. A life built not on love, but on the cold, hard bedrock of never being a victim again. The price had been my soul, but at least I was the one who had set the terms. The news of Julian's and Celine's deaths didn't feel real. It was like hearing about a catastrophe in a distant country, tragic but abstract, unable to pierce the shell of ice I had built around myself. Clara's horrified gaze, the tremor in her voice, they were echoes from a world I had already left. I finished packing the box. The tape dispenser made a definitive snap in the quiet room. Clara was still staring at me, waiting for a crack in my composure, for the grief or the guilt to flood in. It wouldn't. The part of me that could feel those things had been methodically dismantled, its pieces scattered alongside the ruins of my marriage. I need to finish this, I said, my voice flat. The movers will be here soon. Elara. Clara's voice was a whisper, laden with a fear that was no longer just for me but of me. How can you be so calm? I looked at her, my oldest friend, and felt a vast, unbridgeable distance between us. She had stood by me through the anger, the plotting, the execution. But this final bloody conclusion, was a landscape she could not follow me into. What would you have me do, Clara? I asked, not unkindly but with a genuine curiosity. Fall apart? Weep for the man who lied to me for 3 years? Mourn the woman who helped him do it? Their choices led them to that prison visiting room. Not mine. But you lit the fuse, she said, her eyes pleading for some sign of humanity. I held up a mirror, I corrected softly. They were the ones who couldn't stand what they saw. I turned back to the window. The city glittered, indifferent. Life goes on. My life goes on. The movers came and took my things. My new life fit into a surprisingly small number of boxes. I had sold the jewelry, the art, the trappings of the life Julian had given me. I kept only what was mine before him and the substantial financial arsenal I had secured from his ruin. I flew to Santorini first. The whitewashed buildings and azure sea were a postcard come to life, but the beauty felt like a backdrop on a stage. I was an actor without a role. I sat on a terrace overlooking the caldera, a glass of local wine in my hand, and felt nothing. The victory was complete, absolute. And it was utterly empty. I had thought revenge would be a crescendo, a glorious, satisfying climax. Instead, it was a silence so profound it was deafening. I had spent so long defined by my battle against Julian and Celine that without them I was adrift. The fury that had animated me was gone, and in its place was a vast, echoing stillness. From Greece I went to Italy, wandering through ancient Roman ruins. I stood in the Colosseum, touching sun-warmed stone that had witnessed centuries of violence and spectacle. The pettiness of my own drama seemed laughable here. Empires had risen and fallen. Love affairs, betrayals, murders, and revenges, they were all just dust in the wind. I thought of Julian often in those quiet moments. Not with love, not with hate, but with a strange, detached pity. He had been a hollow man, building his empire on a foundation of sand and lies. He needed the adoration, the validation, whether it came from a boardroom or a woman's gaze. In the end, his need had consumed him. My revenge hadn't killed him. It had simply pulled back the curtain on the emptiness that was already there. One afternoon in a small hill town in Tuscany, I found myself in a dusty little church. It was cool and dark inside, a welcome respite from the heat. An old woman was lighting a candle, her movements slow and reverent. I sat in a pew at the back watching the flickering flames. What now, Alaire? The question echoed in the quiet sacred space. You won. You're free. You're rich. What now? The answer didn't come in a flash of lightning. It came as a slow, dawning realization. The revenge had been a destination. I had been so focused on arriving that I had never thought about what I would do once I got there. I couldn't go back to who I was. That woman was gone. But I didn't have to remain this avenging specter, frozen in a moment of righteous anger. The revenge was over. It was time to build something new. Not for anyone else. For me. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I logged out of the secret email accounts I'd used to leak information to reporters. I deleted the audio files, the videos, the screenshots. I erased the digital ghost of my war. It was done. Truly done. Then I opened a new browser window. I started researching. Not corporate espionage or a husband's secrets, but something else entirely. Microloans for women starting businesses in developing countries. Conservation efforts for endangered species. In regions torn by conflict. The cold, strategic part of my mind, honed in battle, began to assess these causes not with sentimentality, but with a ruthless efficiency. Which organizations were the most effective? Which had the lowest overhead? Where could my money and, more importantly, my newly acquired talent for dismantling corruption, do the most real, tangible good? It wasn't about atonement. I didn't feel guilty for what I'd done. Julian and Celine had made their choices and I had made mine. This was about utility. I was a weapon that had been forged in fire. The war was over. But a weapon could be repurposed. It could be used to protect instead of destroy. I sent a large, anonymous donation to an organization that provided legal aid to women trapped in abusive marriages. Felt like closing a circle. A few weeks later I was in Paris. Not the Paris of Celine's fabricated past, but the real one. I was walking along the Seine when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize but with a New York area code. I almost didn't answer. The past was supposed to be dead. But curiosity got the better of me. Alaire Vance? A man's voice asked. It was familiar but I couldn't place it. Who is this? David Chin. The journalist. I stopped walking, leaning against the stone wall of the bridge. David. This is a surprise. I know you're probably done with all of this, he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. But I thought you should know. The SEC investigation into Vance Innovations is wrapping up. Because of the evidence that was unearthed. They've been able to bring charges against several board members who were complicit in Julian's schemes. The company is being completely restructured. The Azure Heights land is being returned to the Blackwood Family Trust, with stipulations for its ethical development. I was silent, watching the dark water of the river flow beneath me. I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No schadenfreude. It was just news. The reason I'm calling, he continued, is that a few of the smaller shareholders, the ones who didn't get wiped out, they're asking about you. They know you're a major shareholder, or a major shareholder. They're talking about trying to find you. They see you as the one who exposed the rot. They think you could lead the effort to rebuild something better. I let out a soft, incredulous laugh that misted in the cool air. Tell them I'm not interested, David. That life is behind me. I figured, he said. There was a pause. What will you do now? I looked out at the city of light, at the lovers strolling hand in hand, at the artists sketching on the banks, at the endless flowing river. I'm not sure yet, I said, and for the first time, the words held a glimmer of possibility instead of emptiness. But I'm working on it. We said our goodbyes. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The world was still broken, still beautiful, still complicated. I had set out to prove that I was not just a substitute, not just a suitable wife. I had proven it in the most devastating way possible. Now the question remained, who was I beyond that? I was Alaire Vance. I was a widow to a marriage that had died long before my husband did. I was a victor in a war that had left no one unscathed. I was free, wealthy, and alone. And for the first time that felt like enough. It felt like a beginning. I turned away from the river and walked into the bustling Parisian evening, one anonymous figure among millions, My past a shadow at my heels and my future a blank, unwritten page. I had survived. Now I had to learn how to live. The end.